Are you sorry? PokerSys. Summary. Midoriya Izuku's descent into rage, and short drop into villainy. Cross-posted onto Quotef and Wattpad less than 3 notes. It might seem cringe at first, but hear me out. Chapter 1, Pink Water. Izuku hated school. He hated the students. He hated the teachers. He hated the fails on assignments he knew he should have passed. He hated the staff. He hated the punishment room. Something he especially hated, though, was lunch. He never ate lunch. If he tried, someone would take his lunch before he got the chance to even sit down. He missed when everyone thought his quirklessness was contagious. At least people left him alone for a while. Today's lunch period was especially bad. People had drawn on his desk again. Someone had even painted a spider lily onto the underside of his desk's lid. A lot of effort, wasted effort that was being destroyed now. He held the dirty, red-stained rag in his equally stained hands. Water dripped into his desk, staining the hardcover of a book with pink. Hey Deku. Deku. Izuku hated that the most. Everyone always pushes him around with that name, permanently stained under his skin. An ugly feeling slowly started bubbling in his chest, so he instead kept scrubbing. Under his soft skin, he's a shell of hate. Hate, hate, hate. The only tie keeping him from drowning in it was his admiration, hero worship. Hi, Kochan. Izuku chirped, some of the raging water draining from his chest. Despite everything, he still really liked Bakugo. It was honestly surprising, but it was hard to hate him. Don't fucking call me Kochan, Deku. Oh, he sounded calmer than normal. What had? Slam. Izuku's face hit his wet desk, nose cracking as the cleaning chemicals started sizzling against his skin. He bit the side of his lip, muffling the pained whimper that nearly escaped his throat. Got it. I'm sorry, was all he could bring himself to say. Warm blood dripped down his lip, landing next to the pink water from a moment ago. A string snapped inside his heart, pulling him further under. He stayed deathly still, waiting to see Bakugo walking over to his own desk before sitting up and wiping the blood off of his inner desk, closing it, and sitting down. He won't ever team up with Bakugo when he becomes a hero, he thinks to himself. When? If he becomes one. Chapter 2, Cuts. Notes. CW, accused SH, though no SH has occurred. Izuku pressed his free palm into the sink, his other hand busy bandaging the gashes running along his arms. They were very graciously gifted to him by a classmate, one who he never bothered to memorize the name of. He did memorize his quirk, though. Iron Claws gives him the ability to turn his fingernails into razor-sharp iron claws. Kind of on the nose, but that was all it did. Effectively useless, unless you wanted to be a chef, or, apparently, a particularly harsh bully. He sucked in a breath through his teeth, watching the blood splatter drip down the school's sink. That one might need stitches. The sound of metal against metal brought him to attention, turning his head to the side and peering at the door. And, standing there of course was his teacher. His eyes were beady, two stumpy antennae sticking out of the top of his forehead. His squint met Izuku's eyes, switched down to the bandaging on his arms, and then back up to his eyes with a disapproving stare. Are you harming yourself again, Midoriya? His voice was harsh, unforgiving. This was not a worried teacher, caring for his student. This was going to only end badly. Izuku pursed his lips, before shaking his head. He can't tell the teacher why, directly. The cuts were there. He didn't believe him the first time, neither did the principal, nor his own mother. So he can't say who put these scars onto his arms, and instead just stays quiet. You know we're going to have to call your mother about this. We care about your safety, and don't want you to keep up this behavior. They have never cared about his safety, and they never will. They've never stopped harm from coming to him, and they've never stopped any attempts against him. Another string snaps in his chest. It feels like he's being swept under, rage bubbling up to his throat. He sighed, angry tears welling up in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I know." The teacher simply nodded, turning around and exiting the bathroom. Dried blood caked and crumbled as Izuku harshly scrubbed his arms, fresh mixing with old. At least, since they're telling his mom, he can get stitches. Chapter 3, Motherly Issues. Summary. CW//PrevChap, triggers, and the title says it all. Izuku sat on the kitchen island, head turned to avoid any sort of eye contact with his mom. Every time this happened, he could never stand to look her in the eyes as she stitched him up. He knows what she thinks was happening. He knows that she'd rather believe the school than him. He knows, and he hates it. He let out a short hiss of air as the new needle pierced his skin, his mother beginning on the stitching. They didn't have anything to numb his arm, but it wasn't anything worse than what he'd been used to. Izuku flinched slightly, making his mother gasp and hold onto his wrist tighter than before. He doesn't want to talk about it. He's tried, and tried to tell her what really happened the last times this happened. She never listens. She doesn't want to. "Izuku, I want to know." You dodge the question every time, but I want to know. Why are you doing this to yourself? You're 14, and it breaks my heart to see this. Her voice was soft, but strained, as if she was barely holding back tears, worried for her child. She doesn't really want to know. Tears welled up in Izuku's eyes. "I don't want to talk about it. Please, don't make me talk about it." He wants to talk about it. He wants to tell her how everyone treats him, how the school treats him, how Bakugo treats him, but he stays silent. He learned that best in elementary. Is it school? Your grades aren't great, but you're passing, and that's what matters to me. She snipped the loose end of the stitching, throwing the needle away and gingerly starting to place bandages on the cuts. Do I have something to do with this? Izuku jumped up at that, pulling his half-wrapped arm out of her grip and clasping both of her hands in his. "It isn't why you, Mom. It isn't. I love you. I couldn't have asked for a better mother." His hands were shaking, legs unsteady. Tears were already dripping down his face from the mere idea that she thought she could be the reason behind his self-harm. Her eyes stared into his, searching for any hint of uncertainty before shooing him back up onto the counter to finish fixing him up. "Are you sure you don't want to talk about it, hun? I would never judge you, I promise. You are my world, and I want to do anything to keep you happy." Izuku averted his eyes once more, resting them on the old kindergarten picture of him and Bakugo for a moment before answering. "Yes." It was silent until she patted his shoulder, signifying that he could hop off of the counter. He slipped off the tank top he had to wear while getting patched up, walking down the hall and into his room. It was his shrine to his heroes, his worship of them. It had slowly started becoming more bare over the months, slowly losing interest in some of the heroes, ones that shaped who he is today. It wasn't any hero specifically, but slowly the posters covered head to toe in the top 10 heroes came down from the walls, his figurines being pushed farther back into his shelves, or beginning to collect dust in the box in his room. His All Might sheets with his face and symbol being swapped out just for the ones with his themed colors. He wasn't sure when this started, but his room was gradually starting to get less full of life. He replaced one of the top 10 posters, at least. It was an old childhood poster that his mom had tried to get him to hang up for hours at the time, but eventually gave up as the heroes won over. It was a small collage, covered in early pictures of him, his mother, and father. He still called with his father every so often, though he hasn't actually seen his face in years. It was nice, seeing family instead of the glaring faces of what he could never be. Izuku also wasn't sure when he had begun thinking like that. He was still going to be a hero, wasn't he? People might not really believe in him, but he could still be a hero. Speaking of, he needed a copy of the picture of him playing heroes with his dad for his collage. He walked down the hall, hearing Inko busying herself in the kitchen. "Hey Mom," he called out, genuine cheer starting to peer through his voice. "Do we still have that one picture of me and Dad playing heroes lying around?" Inko looked at him, cocking her head for a second in thought. "I think so, yes." "Why?" Izuku smiled widely, shaking his hand slightly in excitement. "I need it for a collage, about what I want to be in the future. I want to show that I've wanted to be a hero since I was a little kid." Her face soured, concern gleaming in her eyes. "Oh, dear, are you sure? You could say you want to be a businessman, like your father. We'd always hoped that was the road you'd take. Maybe you would even be able to take over his business one day." Izuku's face fell, and he shrunk back into himself. "I mean, I don't really want to be a businessman, Mom. I've always wanted to be a hero. You know that." "Yeah, but..." He watched as her face scrunched up even more, hands going to hold his bandages. He felt another string snap in his chest, mouth starting to get washed up in the angry tide. "No, Mom, I get it. I get it." His face hardened, tone sounding almost defeated. Hot words stung in the back of his throat, but instead all he could do was turn around and walk back into the hallway, his mother scrambling after him with tearful explanations. "Izuku, you have to understand, your father and I. We just want you to be realistic," she hiccuped, gripping the frame to his bedroom door. "You understand, don't you?" His face was carefully blank, the burning in his throat holding his heart hostage. He doesn't want to snap at his mother, he doesn't know how he'd live with himself if he did. "Yes. I need to get to work on my project, if you don't mind." His hand held the doorknob with as much force a weak middle schooler could. He watched his mother's eyes droop slightly, letting go of his doorframe. "I love you, Izuku. I love you too. I'm sorry, Mom. I'll see you at dinner time." His door clicked shut, Izuku quietly waiting for the sound of Inko's footsteps trailing away from his door. A couple seconds of the sound passed, and then Izuku dropped to the floor, burying his face in his hands. Tears dripped down his hands, wetting his bandages and the carpet underneath him. Why can't he be a hero? Chapter 4, Burns, Blood, and Vomit. Summary. Izuku gets the shit beat out of him, and has started to lose his temper. Izuku stared at his walls. They were bare, now. Not even the family collage was still on the wall, though he had kept the image of him and his father in a picture frame on his desk. The only pieces of hero memorabilia that had been saved from the Izuku purge were All Might figurines, and a small rolled-up All Might poster that he kept on an empty shelf that used to be crammed full of figurines and signed notebook pages. Blood and ink stained the shelves, the walls, and patches of his blankets. He had torn his wounds back open while overfilling the box in his closet, but hadn't noticed before he had finished, and there was blood splattered along his room like stardust. He had tried wiping it all off, but his shelves, sheets, and carpet had all been permanently smudged with the blood stains. He had rebandaged himself, and had now been staring up at the ceiling for a while now. He wasn't going to be a middle schooler for very long, anymore, and it made him nervous. He wasn't sure if he was ready to go to a high school. He had filled out his top 3 high schools he wanted to get into, 2 of them being hero course focused. But who would say he would get into any of them? They didn't have any rules against the quirkless trying for their schools, but it was unlikely. Then again, he was unlikely too. If he worked hard enough, just maybe. His new alarm's unfamiliar shrill snapped Izuku out of his trance, nearly making him trample out of bed. He stumbled over to his closet, hissing as he hit his foot against an abandoned figurine on the floor. Soon enough, he was in his uniform and walking into the main area of his home, sighing slightly as he realized he forgot today was his mother's morning shift. He slipped his shoes on, slung his bag over his shoulder, and rushed out the door to meet the morning. Cold air slapped Izuku's skin, making him bury his face into his blazer and up his pace to school. His bag felt heavy on his shoulders, like something was weighing him back, egging him to stay home, turn back, go anywhere but school. He shook off the nagging feeling, and entered the gates to his school. The day went by relatively normally, possibly even better than normal. He had mostly been avoided, despite the occasional shove or mockery. All in all, it was nice. He felt calm, almost. As he left the school, he got a text from his mother. "Could you buy some pork from the shop? We're out. Are you going to pay me back? JK. I will OFC. Love you, Mom." He followed up the last text with a gif, a cheesy one of an old cartoon character smiling. It was. He didn't know, actually. Fake fan. He took a quick turn, taking a shortcut through the alleyway by his school's entrance. A shiver ran down his spine as he heard multiple pairs of footsteps following him, followed by the familiar pops that were Bakugo's quirk. Great. "Hey, Deku, where do you think you're going?" An uncomfortably loud voice shrilled from behind him. Quirk, knuckle bend. Not at all like what his quirk did. He could stretch his fingers to be unnaturally long, as he was a little too familiar with thanks to the bruises of his quirk lasted on his body. He could never bother to memorize Bakugo's lackeys' names. "Tea to the store," he muttered, not turning to look behind him. He didn't want to know how many there were. The popping got louder for a moment, before a foot planted into his back and kicked him to the floor. He raised his arms up to shield himself, body skidding across the ground for a second. There were 3 of them: Knucklebend, Icestalks, and Bakugo. Icestalks and Knucklebend were behind Bakugo, shit-eating grins covering their faces while Bakugo leaned down to fist his hand in Izuku's collar and drag him back up to meet his eyes. "Look at us when you're speaking, nerd," he hissed, a droplet of spit hitting Izuku's cheek. His eyes turned cold, glaring into Bakugo's eyes. "I have nothing to say to you." He kept his face carefully neutral, watching as Bakugo flared up in anger. His lackeys grabbed Izuku by the shoulders, the boy stumbling as his collar was dropped before getting slammed into the wall. After that, it was just a good couple minutes of Bakugo using him like a punching bag. He could feel the bruises forming, coughs bubbling up whenever he was punched particularly hard in the stomach. Everyone flinched away when Izuku lurched, vomiting up pure stomach acid. He felt woozy, basically running on fumes. "Fuck you, Kochan," he spat, spitting some bile onto Bakugo's uniform. Something snapped in Bakugo's eyes, Izuku's eyes widening as he raised an open palm, rearing it back. Sparks flew in the air, shimmering almost pleasantly. "Don't call me Kochan." Bakugo's hand swung down, the sparks suddenly erupting into a hot explosion when the slap met Izuku's face. His ears were ringing. It was so hard to see, but he could feel the lackeys tense up and then drop him like he was made of coal. His face felt wet, where Bakugo had slapped him, but hot everywhere else. Much too hot. He pressed his hand to his face, shakily watching the 3 blurry figures back up unsteadily. One lurched over, vomiting on the ground behind Bakugo. "Icestalks," he thought. Knucklebend grabbed Bakugo and Icestalks by their sleeves, quickly dragging them away. His hands were soaked in something wet, something hot. His face felt hot to the touch, too hot. Everything was too hot. He pulled his hands away from his face, squinting at his hands. They were coated in red, his sleeves stained as it was running down his arms and ruining his bandages again. Blood. His hands were caked in it, and he could slowly start feeling the burns sink into his flesh. He stood, unsteadily hobbling over to his backpack while gripping his stomach. He coughed, feeling something more blood, maybe flick out of his mouth. He dug into his bag's smaller pocket, grabbing the gauze. He covered his face, maybe a little excessively, and lifted up his bag. He could feel the blood cooling, staining his hands and his sleeves, the drips that had run down his neck sticky and uncomfortable against his skin. He slung his bag over his shoulder, stumbling out onto the street. Everything was slightly less blurry now, thanks to the bandage covering his worse-off eye, but his ears were still ringing. He wandered down the street for a couple of blocks, before finding an empty alleyway. He wandered in by a couple feet, and then collapsed. He never did make it home that night. Chapter 5, Missed. Notes. Hey all. Apologies for the late update. A couple people close to me were sent to the hospital recently, so I haven't exactly had time to update, haha. CWS. Attempted suicide. Izuku groggily shifted his head, unsteady eyes scanning his room. This wasn't his room. He was laying against the pavement of an alley, dirty and sore. He patted his face, feeling gauze and bandages, and a mix of dry and wet blood. Bakugo had attacked him the other night, not his normal attacks, or fights. He could have. Izuku shook off the thoughts, wiping his face and hands as clean he could make it before hobbling to stand up. He had to get to school. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, miraculously untouched, and cursed as he realized it was dead. He managed to wander into school, a good 30 minutes late, and get himself into class. Everything around him was quieter, and he couldn't feel his right ear. Had Bakugo blown his ear off? Well. It didn't matter for now. He dropped into his seat, pulling out his hero notebook and writing down miscellaneous facts as the teacher berated him for showing up late and looking disgusting. But, as all things, class moved on. It was mostly just the teacher droning on, words muffled and quiet in Izuku's ears. At some point, though, the teacher pulled out a couple sheets of paper. Well, we were going to have a career day, but we all already know what you all want to be, heroes. He tossed the pages up into the air, the class erupting into screams and laughter. And all of you also want to go to UA, isn't that right? The teacher hummed, staring down at a separate page that he hadn't scattered across the room. Even you, Midoriya? Suddenly, instead of erupting cheers and chatter, everything had gone quiet, people turning to stare at him. He could feel Bakugo's eyes burning into his skull, Izuku shrinking into his seat anxiously. Laughter started bubbling up from a couple of the classmates, before everyone settled down. Ice Storks looked sick to his stomach, staring back at him with an unfamiliar gaze. The rest of the day drifted on, and soon enough the school day was over. He felt floaty, and hadn't moved from his seat throughout the entire day. He only shot up when his notebook got snatched out of his hands, and he suddenly became a little too aware of his surroundings. The sun was peeking down the horizon, and it was just him and Bakugo in the classroom. You still want to be a hero? You keep fucking looking down on me, Deku. Bakugo snarled, peeking through Izuku's notes. Give it back, Kochen. Izuku yelped, unsteadily lunging for the notes. Bakugo grabbed him by the shoulder, raising the notes up above his head with his free hand. You know what, Deku? He shoved Izuku backward, dropping the notes between his hands and letting his quirk scorch the pages before tossing it out of the open window. If you wanna be a hero so bad, there's one way to do it. Pray for a quirk in your next life, and take a swan dive off the roof of a building. Izuku froze in shock. Bakugo had done a lot of things since Izuku got diagnosed quirkless. He screamed, punched, threw him around, and overall treated him like shit. But this was the first time that he had told Izuku to kill himself. Others had. They'd screamed it into his face and carved it into the backs of his eyelids with their sharp words. But when Bakugo told him to kill himself, he could feel the sharp pang in his chest. Bakugo shoved past Izuku, kicking his bag on the way out of the classroom. Izuku stood, silent for a couple of minutes. His uncovered eye drifted out of the window, before he slowly collected his things and hobbled out of the door and down to the koi pond below the window. His notebook was charred, and soaked with pond water. He gingerly picked it up, flinching as he saw ink and lead-stained water drip onto the ground. He shook it a couple of times, before settling it back into his bag. He needed to get home. His brain was nothing but light static, motions of going home ingrained into his mind. Home. He hadn't gone home last night, his mom must be worried sick. He frowned, tears welling up in his eye as he made his way through the underpass. Suddenly, the grating sound of metal against pavement and wet sloshing was loud and rapidly approaching behind him. Sludge enveloped his body, pinning his body practically immobile besides his thrashing. Before he could scream for help, slime completely covered his mouth and nose. He felt the slime sliding down his throat, completely stopping his breath. I normally wouldn't resort to this, kid, but All Might's in town, and you're the quickest way out of here. The sludge villain's voice was raspy, but wet and dark just like his form. Izuku's thrashing slowly weakened, feeling the sludge tearing its way through his lungs. He was scared. A large gust of wind blew him to the side, and for a moment, everything went black. When he came to, he immediately lurched back against the ground and coughed up a large hunk of sludge. Ew. His eyes shifted up, and he scrambled back with violent stammers running through his mouth. All Might. The muscular man towered over Izuku, his smile glaring down at the boy. Izuku's eyes were shaking and wide, shock covering his face. Are you all right, young Midoriya? All Might's voice boomed, following with hard laughter. He knew his name. All Might knew his name. Yes. Yes, can you sign my? Izuku dragged his notebook out, opening it and gasping in surprise at the signature scrawled across 2 of the pages. Oh wow. Thank you. How did you know my name? I read it on the cover of your notebook. Now, my boy, I must really get going. Wait, All Might, I need to. Izuku slung his bag over his shoulder, scrambling up to limp closer to All Might, and suddenly the both of them were flying in the air. Izuku screamed, latching onto All Might's leg and staring down at the rapidly disappearing ground beneath him. His sleeve caught on a button of All Might's khakis, nearly dislocating his arm at takeoff. All Might. What the hell? Hey, let go. All Might gasped, shaking his leg a little to try and let Izuku loose. No. If I let go now, I'll die. All Might quieted, before nodding and landing on the nearest roof. Izuku fell off of his leg, backing up and standing. He stared at the hero in shock, before practically jumping to speak again. Wait. Please, wait. I really cannot, my bow. All Might coughed, blood splattering against the ground in front of him as a plume of steam surrounded him, and out of the smoke emerged a tall and frail man. All Might? Yes, my boy. Don't be alarmed, but this is a very important secret you must keep. The world must not know that this is who All Might is. His voice was raspier, tired, in pain. He seemed so All Might. Well, I need to get going. Do you think I can be a hero without a quirk? Izuku blurted out, staring down at the ground where All Might's blood had pooled. To be frank, no. You need to be realistic. There are many ways to save people that isn't being a hero. Without a quirk, you'd just be a liability in the field. All Might's words felt like a knife through his lungs, slashing his last strand, keeping him above water and submerging him in the waves. Tears welled up in Izuku's eye, dripping down his cheek. See ya, kid. Izuku sat down on the roof for a couple of minutes, watching the skyline from the roof. He didn't know what to do. It makes sense. It really did. Now, everything. A round of explosions rang out in the distance, causing Izuku to snap his head up. He'd basically memorized that sound. It was Bakugo's quirk. Without thinking, he rushed down the stairwell to find the source. The entirety of an alleyway was ablaze, heroes flinching back at Bakugo's explosions and thrashing. And the thing holding him hostage? It was the sludge villain, that damn sludge villain. He ran forward, pushing through the crowd and throwing his backpack at the sludge villain. A pen pierced the villain's eye, causing it to momentarily lose its grip on Bakugo. Izuku grabbed his slightly exposed forearm and dragged his bully out of the death trap and pushing him behind him. The familiar gust of wind swept through the alleyway, putting out all of the fires and obliterating the villain. Bakugo vomited up sludge, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. Izuku quickly moved away from him, walking over to collect all of the belongings that had been strewn against the alleyway ground. The heroes around him were yelling, berating him for jumping in. He didn't care. He collected his things and left his nearly destroyed notebook as he walked out of the alley. He ended up wandering back to that damn roof. The sun was setting behind the roofline, the stories of the building seeming endless. He grabbed a clean notebook, a pen, and started writing a note. Hello to whoever is reading this. My name was Midoriya Izuku. I was 14. And my favorite food was katsudon. I know you might not understand this, no one but maybe 2 people will. Tell Midoriya Inko, my mom, and Bakugo Katsuki that I'm sorry. All of my valuables are in the back of my closet, and she can choose between giving them away and selling them. I think they will give back a good sum of money. I had no friends. And I'm sorry that you had to find this note. I hope to be luckier in the afterlife. Izuku slipped off his shoes, placing them in the corner of the roof next to his bag, and swung his first leg over the railing. The last pieces of sunlight slipped through the cracks of the buildings before disappearing, and with that he swung his other leg over the railing. His socks slid slightly against the concrete ledge, and he let out a shaky sigh. He could feel his heart beating in his throat, and he flipped around to be facing away from the ledge. His hands released the railing, and for a second he could feel the adrenaline spike through his chest before he was enveloped in purple mist. And for a moment, the world was quiet. Chapter 6, Medicality, Notes. Shorter chapter for today. Loud medical machines beeped around Izuku, calling out in time with the pounding headache behind his eyes. He could hear movement around him, shuffling of scrubs and quiet muttering amongst people. He felt a hand against his arm, 2 fingers pressing against his wrist. The burned side of his face felt tight, joints feeling just about fused to the soft bed underneath him. He could feel the hospital lights shining in his face, and whined slightly as he attempted to move. Wait. Hospital? Izuku's eyes shot open, attempting to shoot upright and grunting with the effort. The room was off-puttingly white, everything in it nearly reflecting off of each other. Doctors in their 2 bright lab coats shifted around, suddenly coming to a stop as they heard the beige covers slide against his 2 white clothes. He felt like a bug under glass, the goggles donning all of the doctors' faces feeling like microscopes. Hello? Izuku pulled the blankets up, arms shaking against the 2 tight bandages and the tubes running into the crooks of his elbows. He felt out of it, like someone had put a blanket over his mind. Where am I? One of the doctors, a tall man with bleached locks and shaking hands, stepped up to Izuku's bedside, looking down at a clipboard with a frown. His eyes were shielded with a set of goggles, but his brow furrowed in focus. Izuku Midoriya. 14, right. How are you feeling? The doctor looked up from his clipboard, giving a smile to the frazzled boy. It felt more like a baring of teeth than an actual smile. Sensei found you in quite the upsetting part of life, huh? Don't worry, it isn't unfamiliar for him. It's lucky he found you when he did, too. Would you like to hear the damage report? The huh? Yes? Izuku squeaked, pulling the blanket up to circle his neck. Regarding your facial burn. It will not heal correctly, unfortunately. We could barely salvage your eye, and your ear is... well, your ear is gone, unfortunately. The scarring is permanent unless we can find someone with a quirk to help with that, and your hearing and vision will be impacted negatively. Your face will feel tight for a while, that's normal. It's just the scar tissue trying to adjust to your face, considering how deep the burn was. And please don't move too fast, we had to do surgery. You had some internal bleeding that would have been fatal if Sensei hadn't gotten you to us in time. You're very lucky to have been found by him, the doctor rambled, puffing up in pride whenever mentioning Sensei. Izuku pressed a palm to his face, other hand grabbing at his shirt. Oh. When can I go home? Izuku asked, face pinching. My mom is probably super worried about me. I didn't go home the night before and she probably is super worried about me. The doctor cocked his head, the sound of the other doctors shuffling back around the room. What do you mean, go home? Go home? To my apartment? Izuku started to feel his throat close, panic beginning to fill the bottom of his chest. The doctor laughed, setting the clipboard down on a desk and grabbing Izuku by the shoulder. His claws dug into Izuku's flesh, the bearing grin reappearing. No. Don't you know? This is your home now. Sensei picked you especially. It's an honor, really. He pushed his locks to somewhat tuck behind his ear. Izuku stared at the doctor, eyes wide. What? I know it must be a lot to take in, but don't worry. Your personal escort will be here very soon. Hold still, Midoriya. We need to get you unhooked, and then you'll be having a very special meeting. The doctor grabbed Izuku's wrist, pulling his arm out to be flat before moving his hand up to his forearm to remove the tubes running under his skin. Monitors unhooked and quieted around him, and he pulled Izuku up to stand on shaky legs. A dark, swirling vortex appeared on an empty portion of the wall, and out stepped a tall smoky person in a suit. Their eyes were a glowing yellow, wisping away into the air as they spoke. Midoriya. My name is Kurogiri, you will be coming with me. I what? No, I don't know any of you. You've kidnapped me, I want to go home. Izuku's voice cracked, tears welling up in his eyes. We saved you. Everything will be explained if you come with me, I can assure you. Kurogiri's voice echoed, leaning down slightly to meet Izuku's eyes. All right. And then, Izuku went through the swirling black mist, Kurogiri following close behind. Chapter 7, Sensei. Notes. Short chapter again for today, so that I can make a long chapter later. Izuku's hands shook against Kurogiri's sleeve, throat tightening. Whatever was through this simple wooden door felt more dangerous than anything he'd felt in his life. More intimidating than All Might, and scarier than Bakugo. Whatever it was, he didn't want to see it. Unfortunately, Kurogiri didn't care what Izuku did or didn't want to do, and ushered him through the door. The person in front of him was completely hooked up with tubes and wires, looking as if he was hanging onto life by the thin tube that was keeping him breathing. He was dressed as formally as Kurogiri, but still felt so powerful it was going to drive Izuku to his knees. Izuku. It's good to meet you in person. You were out for a couple of days and I was eager to meet you. The man's sensei, a voice in the back of his mind whispered voice was deep and smooth, as if it was laced with too thick honey. It drew Izuku closer to him, fear overtaking any form of awe he might have for this man. Who? Are you sensei? Izuku asked, voice timid and hands grabbing the too tight bandages on his arms for support. Sensei chuckled, sitting up slightly in his chair. Yes, I am. How, may I ask, did you find that name? Your doctor. He really admires you. Why did you save me? Why can't I go home? Words started tumbling out of his mouth, as if once he'd started he couldn't stop. He clapped his hands over his mouth, the throat tightening feeling returning back tenfold. I saved you because I saw potential in you, Izuku, and if it didn't irk him that the stranger kept referring to him with his first name, and I couldn't let such a betrayed child die. Bakugo, I think his name is, he's the one who marred your face, and caused your urgent need for surgery. He didn't get any repercussions, did he? He even attacked you the day after. How does that make you feel? How do you know about that? Izuku gasped for air, tears welling up in his eyes. He knew Bakugo was bad. He knew he was bad, and treated him horribly, but he didn't think he'd be hearing it. He'd chosen to ignore it, and pretend everything was all right because no one would ever tell Bakugo that he was in the wrong. It makes me feel upset. He didn't even say sorry. He ended up muttering, looking down and away from Sensei. Look at me, Izuku. The voice was so commanding that out of pure shock he looked back up to the man. Your mother, she willfully ignored that you were being mistreated. She even dismissed your dreams, time and time again, and Almighty crushed your dreams on the same roof you threw yourself off of. Doesn't that make you angry? Suddenly, the waves crashing in his chest were whirling up so strongly inside of him. They were crushing his lungs, feeling the rage and tears bubble up and spill over in a crash. Izuku grabbed his hair, tugging it downward as tears washed down his face and stung his new facial scar. He looked back up to the man after a moment of silent crying, face hardened in rage. Yes. It makes me so angry no one cared. No one, not one person ever told me I could do what I want. We care, Izuku. We can help you. You can get revenge against the society that had treated you so horribly. Do you want that? We could even help you get revenge against that Kochan of yours. The man's grin was wide under his breathing mask. With Izuku's nod, a palm lurched forward and in a flash of hot pain, the world went white. Chapter 8, Analysis. Notes. We're finally getting out of the very beginning. Izuku jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat. His hands instinctively went to cover his face, patting it and wincing when he felt sharp pricks slide in tandem with his hand. He felt short of breath, eyes welling up in tears. The white-hot feeling of all for one's quirk coursing through his veins still lingered, leaving painful and erratic twitches in his hands and legs. His eyes surveyed the room, immediately noting that this wasn't the same room as before. Though, oddly, it still had medical equipment scattered across the warm brown cabinets. One end of the wall was lined in shelves, nearly empty except for a couple of notebooks and his old school books. Some of his old notebooks were here, too. Odd. I was sent to retrieve some of your old items, in hopes to get you more comfortable. Kurogiri's voice echoed around the room, making Izuku flinch and spin to look around. They were standing comfortably in a corner of the room, a book clasped in their misty hands. Izuku squinted warily, mouth downturning into a frown. How long were you standing there? Izuku asked, pulling his covers up higher to cover himself as he did in the hospital-esque room. It is my duty to get you settled in, they responded plainly, setting the book on the bedside table. It was something fantasy-esque, an old-world book. It's a good book. I really recommend it. They tapped the cover, misty eyes squinting in a smile. Izuku pursed his lips, instead choosing to stare at Kurogiri expectantly. So, what are we doing today, to get me settled? Kurogiri clasped their hands. Yes. 2 days ago, when you met Sensei, he took a small peek into your thoughts, to aid me to make everything best suit you. I've got a few boxes, and I will leave you for an hour to settle your thoughts and arrange your room. Izuku nodded, watching as a swirling portal formed on the wall. Kurogiri stepped through, and 2 large boxes slid through before the portal closed. At that moment, Izuku allowed himself a moment to really and truly panic. He didn't know how he got himself into this mess. He had agreed to Sensei that night in a rage and pain-fueled haze. But, staring at those boxes, there isn't any turning back, no matter how much he can plead to be let go. He chose, instead of moping for the time being, he would search through the boxes. In the one he'd picked, it was filled to the brim with clothing, hoodies, plain graphic tees, sweatpants, jeans, a desktop computer. What? He paused, gingerly pulling the computer out of the box. It had been wedged neatly in the middle of all of the clothes, seemingly calling to him. He pushed the metallic tray of medical equipment to the side, setting the computer in the center of his desk. His hands traced over the edges, feeling almost entranced. This was the computer he'd been wanting since it came out. It was Sheen, a bronze-orange color comparing nicely to the soft green peach in the center. This was one of the best, well-made peach computers in the history of the company, and he'd been begging for one just like this since his 12th birthday. He backed away from it, deciding to instead mindlessly toss his clothes into dresser drawers. They had even got his fashion sense correct, and got the right kind of shoes for him. How did they know all of this about him? He knew that Kurogiri told him that Sensei had peeked through his thoughts, but they weren't serious. Right? What was Sensei's quirk? Maybe it had something to do with mental manipulation, or, well... Izuku shrugged off the sinking pit of cold settling inside his stomach, quickly opening the second box instead. Sensei's quirk didn't really matter anyway, did it? Inside this box, there were basic necessities, thick black sheets, a dark green comforter, and a couple empty notebooks in an array of colors, each with their own assigned pen. There were a couple of posters, but they weren't very interesting. The last thing, at the bottom of the box, was an old All Might plushie, clearly worn but well kept, one of his hair spikes stitched back together with a strong yellow thread. It was his plushie, the one that he'd left in his bed at home. Did these people know where he lived? Izuku yelped as the void presented itself back into his room, Kurogiri stepping through. Their head tilted to the side, seemingly a sign of confusion. "You are finished, yes? How did you like your gifts?" Kurogiri asked, stepping forward and grabbing the comforter from the too-clean floor. He swept the sheets off of the bed, and quickly replaced them with Izuku's new sheets. Yeah, I like them a lot." He bit his lip to stop the flow of questions from escaping from his brain and out into the real world. "You will have a chance to thank him in person soon," Kurogiri hummed, grabbing the untouched book on the nightstand and holding it out to Izuku. "I really recommend this book, even if it is from the old world. I think you'll find it enlightening." Izuku absently nodded, looking down at the cover. It was a childish name, called Wolves and Sheep. "Thank you," he mumbled, holding it to his chest. "Oh, and one more thing before I leave you. You have an assignment, so Sensei may test the limits and capabilities of your strengths. Compile an analysis of a hero. Any hero you'd like." Kurogiri glanced back at Izuku, before disappearing inside of the portal. Izuku let out a sigh, placing his notebooks and new book onto his bookshelf. Everything was too unfamiliar, it was unsettling. He grabbed one of the empty notebooks, simply titling it with analysis and booting up his laptop. He sighed in relief when he saw he had access to the internet, booting up Google and getting to work. Izuku eventually decided to pick a small hero named Hammer Time. He had a pretty simplistic quirk: his hands from the wrist up could turn into hammers. His civilian name is Matsumura Daisuke, and he's 32. He went to an insignificant school, and got his hero's license later on. He has brown hair, and grey eyes. His blood type is B, and he has severe arachnophobia to the point that he'll cry and throw up at just a picture of one. The best way to make him effectively useless in a fight is to play with his fears, or to simply chop his hands off well before the wrist. The second one would make him technically quirkless, removing him from a fight completely and traumatizing his team as a bonus. The best matchups for him would be the villain's chainsaw, Moonfish, or anyone with a sharp quirk/arachnid quirk. The worst matchups would be any short-distance fighters with no way to completely incapacitate him quickly. His fighting style indicates he's too reliant on his quirk, so once his hands are gone he's going to be completely out of the fight. A couple more pages of the notebook were filled with the analysis, and he shut the notebook in satisfaction. He wrote for Sensei on the cover, and set it off to the side to focus on the computer screen. He hovered over the keys for a moment, before typing in the Facebook website address. It pulled up without a hitch, and he instinctively typed his name in. Auntie Mitsuki, his mom, and hell even Bakugo and his school had posted about him recently. His mom had very obviously had a picture of him edited to have a halo atop the head, and they were using that image for their posts. They all had the same message: Fly high, you will be in our prayers. He was so loved and we are so sad he is gone. He'd almost forgotten that he'd attempted suicide before being taken and kidnapped, the back of his mind urged. Why? By Sensei. His eyes angrily narrowed at the post that had been made by his school. They didn't care. He didn't know why they'd even bothered holding a memorial for him. He hates his school, he hates Bakugo, he hates Auntie Mitsuku, he hates his mother, he hates all of them. None of them really cared, none. Izuku quickly closed out the tab on the computer, instead choosing to mindlessly scroll forums until it was late in the night. He hardly acknowledged when Kurogiri entered the room to grab the analysis book and leave. It didn't matter. At least his favorite forums could keep him occupied. Chapter 9, A Warm Welcome. Summary. Hi readers, I'm back from my long break and I need an opinion. Do you think I should post more flashback chapters / Izuku training, not law related, or just get right into the good stuff? Blood-caked knuckles slammed into the wall, torn skin and paint flakes stinging deep. With a yowl and another bloodied fist slamming into the bloodied wall, a hole broke through. The wood splintered violently, cracking inward and leaving branches out from the plain paint. Izuku cried out angrily, slamming his fists into the walls once more before sliding to the ground. He had been meeting with Sensei a lot over the past couple of weeks. Sensei says that he's smart, one of the smartest students he's ever had, that he's lucky to have Izuku to work against the heroes. Meetings with Sensei, no matter how kind he is, always are filled with pain. He had been getting trained, being pitted against these hulking monsters called Nomu. These things, they were always so unpredictable. Izuku had been broken more times than he can count on one hand, but Sensei always saves him before they can truly finish him off. Sensei says he's weak now. Izuku hates it. He hates it. He hates how weak he would be against heroes. Sensei hadn't just been filling his head with praise, he'd been letting Izuku in on the poor heroes playing pity out on the streets. Izuku's head felt fuzzy every time he thought about it, and the mere remembrance of his past. It hurt too much to remember all the ways the world failed him. All he can remember from his old life easily is Kochen, and he hates Kochen. He hates everything about him, and he hates the way that hero wannabe ruined his life, destroyed his face, bloodied and scarred him at every turn, ruined him. Sensei says it's good that I have a rival, and that even though it isn't all might, Kochen will be the power that drives Izuku to the top. Izuku held his bloody fists to his chest, ignoring the wet feelings seeping through his shirt and onto his chest. Hot tears welled in his eyes, hands wringing in the front of his shirt harshly. He'd been crying a lot. The new emotions Sensei had been dragging out of him burned. They were hot coals that were never meant to see the light. His vision blurred, head pounding and chest choking up. He could barely feel the mist pooling around his back and pulling him from his fetal position. Izuku. It is time to get up. Kurogiri was in his room, voice empty and warbling. Izuku pushed himself out of the grip, flexing his hands and wiping his tears with his forearms before stepping through the mist. Instead of the dark room he's become accustomed to, he stepped into a dusty bar. It wasn't dingy, it was very nice in all honesty, but parts of the place seemed eroded, like termites had dug their way through anything and everything, and left only dust in their wake. Izuku covered his mouth, coughing roughly. Kurogiri, who the fuck is that? A grating, throaty voice rang out across the nigh empty space. A pale blue-haired man, with scars and cracks and blood streaking across his face like an unnatural art display. His lips were curled into a sneer of disgust, one hand scratching at his neck and the other clenching and unclenching, dust fluttering from his hand to the floor. Ah, so he was the termite. Izuku took a cautionary step back, looking back to stare at Kurogiri. Kurogiri? His voice was meek, hands shaking and palms sweating as they had the first time he'd met Sensei. This person had a very different vibe from Sensei, though. He was scary, yes, but he didn't incite a bone-deep chill in the way Sensei did. He isn't dangerous. Ah, yes. Izuku, you're now properly equipped to be staying in the bar with us. Shigaraki Tomura, Izuku will be staying in the bar with us for the foreseeable future. Kurogiri took place behind the bar, grabbing a rag and beginning to scrub away at the dust. Izuku and Shigaraki stared at each other wearily, before the older male stepped menacingly towards Izuku. What are you? Shigaraki hissed, nails scraping bloodily at his neck. Izuku's eyes darted between his hands and his face, before coming up with the most thought-out answer known to man. You know you're hurting yourself, right? Izuku spluttered out, wiping his hands on his shirt and hissing, I mean no offense, but your hands are probably really dirty because of your termite quirk, and you really don't want to get any residue in your bloodstream, you know? He took a step back, pressing himself against the wall. Termite quirk. Shigaraki strided forward, standing directly in front of Izuku. My quirk is decay. It destroys anything I touch with all 5 fingers, and I destroy anything that annoys me. And you seem like an annoying person. Stay out of my light, or else. Tomura grabbed the front of Izuku's shirt, watching the front immediately crumble and fall away. Don't talk about my scratching, with your bloody knuckles. Hypocrites are annoying. Izuku stood frozen, like a deer in headlights for a few moments. He watched Shigaraki disappear into a room behind the bar, and then rushed up to Kurogiri. What do you mean I'm staying here? I liked my old room. Master said that you and Shigaraki Tomura need to get well acquainted, and this is the best way to do so. I don't like him. You both are very important to Master's plan, Izuku. It would disappoint him if you couldn't manage to get along. Izuku frowned, slumping against the bar. He's gonna kill me, I know it. He pressed his palms into the wood, watching the skin pale. When am I seeing Sensei again? He muttered out, rubbing his palm in circles. We aren't sure. Now that you're here, you will be seeing him a lot less. What? What? Why? Izuku shot up, cold striking him down to his core. He couldn't just be ripped away from Sensei like this. It wasn't fair, it didn't make sense. He couldn't get stronger without Sensei, he couldn't. You'll be training with me and Shigaraki Tomura, from now on. Master will only call you in when he needs you. Kurogiri, enragingly enough, seemed completely calm about this, but Izuku needed to think rationally. Sensei, Master thought highly of him. He thought highly of Tomura, too, he assumed. He just had to trust Sensei. Your room is already unpacked. I recommend going through it, and making sure I didn't miss anything. Go through that door, and then up the stairs. It's the first door you'll see. He didn't want to go through the door. That's where the termite crawled. It was probably its den, a nest of dust and death. It's too dangerous. But, still, he opened the door and entered the heart. It smelled disgusting, dust caking the room. Half-eaten controllers and gaming systems were littered across the floors, all lights but the blue of the television were off. It illuminated Shigaraki's already pale skin looking transparent under the colors. He quickly and quietly went up the stairs, under the protection of the violent gaming noises. He opened the door, quietly closing it behind him. This room was much smaller than his old room. It had a desk, a bed, a bookshelf, and a nightstand. His bed was also smaller, more well suited to his teenage body, but with slightly thinner sheets. His clothes, now in fewer amounts, were in small drawers under his bed. The only things on and in his desk were his computer, notebooks, and pencils. His bookshelf held his analysis notebooks, and the book Kurogiri gave him. He hadn't bothered to read it yet. At least he still had his plushie. Suddenly, there was a rapid knock on his door, and immediately the now familiar voice of Shigaraki sounded across the barrier. Don't open the door, Paladin. Kurogiri has informed me of your Use. I want to put you to work after Kurojiri comes to pick you up for your training. Welcome. A couple moments later, the sound of footsteps going down the stairs was heard. His brow furrowed confusedly, sitting on his bed. What a kind welcome.